Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. And welcome in association with our producing partner, Showtime. Welcome to the FOLCS film series. Tonight's film, Detainee 001, and is featuring the film's director, Greg Barker. It's in commemoration, tonight's film series is in commemoration of 9/11. And this is clearly a 9/11 film. The film is actually available on Showtime this evening at midnight. So I think it's available for streaming this evening at midnight on Showtime and any other portal through Showtime. It's a film not just about 9/11, it's incredibly timely because it's a film about Afghanistan and the Taliban and the very, very early days of 9/11. It was a reminder of America's involvement and invasion of Afghanistan and who really the Taliban were. The film is titled Detainee 001 because it's really about the very first detainee who happened to have been an American Taliban member, John Walker Lindh. And the film is also about although it's not titled, it's about Casualty 001, CIA operative Mike Spann, who was the first casualty of 9/11. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, welcome. Please go on Facebook, go on folks.org and give us your email address so we can give you notice of our future events. If you have a question for Greg, you can leave it in the Q&A box. Greg is a really great filmmaker. He's an Academy Award nominated documentarian for the HBO film Manhunt, which was a film about the hunt search for Osama bin Laden. He made two films about a UN envoy in Iraq, both called Sergio. One was the documentary Sergio. The second was a feature film, which I saw about 6 months ago on Netflix. It's really terrific, which I think is Greg's first dramatic feature, Sergio. And he also made a film about the final year, again, dealing with President Obama and national security. It's fair to say that Greg Barker is dedicated, committed to counterterrorism and the war on terror. He's clearly an artistic expert on it. And it's wonderful inviting him to our stage. Greg, welcome.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Hello.
Greg, this is an interesting film and an extraordinarily timely film, right? When you think about the evacuation of Afghanistan, you take us to the very beginning of the invasion of Afghanistan. We are now in a conflict about having left people behind. Your movie is about what was done to try to claim one dead body. It does seem, it's such an interesting contrast, right? I mean, it just so happens that at the point that the first casualty, Mike Spann, was killed, the United States' involvement in the war was even more ramped up to make sure that we were able to claim his body. And so on one hand, we evacuate without bringing all of our embassy officials and others. And in your film, we see the lengths to which even reclaiming one body, the very first of the many casualties. So let me just ask you a personal question, which is that the film raises, typical for a FOLCS film and a Showtime film, it raises lots of important ideas. It's an idea-rich film. But you know, it's very neutral, I think. It's neutral in its opinion. It's a true documentary. It's documenting a moment in history, but it doesn't really have, you know, a very strong point of view. Is John Walker Lindh a traitor, treasonous, evil personified? Or is he just some guy who from Northern California, San Francisco, who converted to Islam and he became loyal to the Taliban, but he wasn't necessarily an enemy of the United States? You know, there's a number of issues that the film raises. Are there any personal feelings that you have about Lynn, about Spann, about America's involvement in the war, about the treating of enemy combatants either as detainees that would not be subject to constitutional adherence principles, or that they should be subject to military commissions and they should lose all protections of constitutional rights. Just tell us if there's anything that's not in the film that is a Greg Barker point of view that we should know.
Well, I guess, yeah, thank you for that introduction. And this film was about 4.5 years in the making. So the fact that it's coming out now on the anniversary of 9/11, as the Taliban have retaken Afghanistan, is just sheer coincidence. But it's surreal to have it come out now, but appropriate, I think. I think making the film, John Walker Lindh was called The American Taliban, captured on the battlefield, literally the same week as Osama bin Laden is slipping away through Tora Bora into Pakistan. And I think he became, at the time, a kind of the face of the enemy, which all the more potent because he was an American, right? But I think making the film, of course, I wondered, who he was, why he got there. But I felt that he was, in a way, less interesting. He was, he was less interesting than as a person than what his story told us about ourselves. He was a teenager from Marin County, California, sort of upper middle class family, who went on some kind of spiritual quest. He happened to choose Islam. He went off, made a lot of kind of pretty stupid choices, but more stupid than most teenagers, but kind of in that same vein, and ended up, with first in Pakistan and then goes into Afghanistan and joins the Taliban. And then you can argue that the story became much more kind of, complicated and less kind of innocent at that point. But still, John's journey, I found kind of ultimately unknowable. And frankly, I just didn't find him to be that significant of a figure. He was kind of just caught up in the ways of history. What I did find interesting was what his story tells us about ourselves. How do we react? And I think this is the deeper question I've been trying to get at, kind of like the Greg Barker in the movie. It's not what I think of John, is how has 9/11 changed us, our psyche, our view of the world, our view of our role within it. And I think we're still grappling with all of that. So you look for, in a film, you kind of want to say you have clear answers. There's not a lot of clear answers in this. If you want clear answers, watch something else. But it raises questions that I think we're still grappling with. And that's what I try to do with it.
One of those questions, Greg, which goes to the point that you just made about us, which I found sort of interesting. Someone at some point in the film says, no one was really interested in why anyone would have all of this hatred towards America. Like nobody seems to be interested in the anti-American animus and how even an American kid, a teenager from Marin County, could have bought into that. And that the film raises the question, because it is a good question. No one was answering that question. I would say this, that it made me think when I saw the film, Greg, we're living in a time of critical race theory and Black Lives Matter, and bashing in the United States now among Americans is in fashion. To discuss America's sins is something that's actually, get you invited to the right parties nowadays. And I'm wondering whether you think, well, that question could not have been asked at 9/11, given what had just happened. And I'm wondering, well, what if it was today? It just seems today where it's more fashionable to ask these kinds of questions. Would America been more willing to go, why do they hate us so much? Why would they commit suicide flying into buildings, crashing into the Pentagon? Why would they, what do they hate us about so much? Hey, I thought the Saudis were our friends, right? These were the things that people were saying on 9/12, 9/13, right? They were saying, I don't get it. And no one was really connecting any dots until 9/13, 9/14, because people were going, oh, right, the USS Cole. Oh, yes, the World Trade Center had already been bombed almost 10 years ago. Oh, yes, the embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. No one had connected all those dots, and that would have been a good time to connect the dots, right? So what do you think about that, about the idea of asking that question and whether America could have ever been receptive to it?
I think after the tragedy of and the shock of 9/11, that was not something that people wanted to necessarily reflect upon, right? But I do. Well, that day I was living in London at the time, and I remember the next day there was a big gathering outside of St. Paul's Cathedral. I think the Queen led a moment of silence or something, but I was in this crowd of, it's like 50, 60,000 people, incredibly diverse, in the heart of London, Americans, Brits, people from all over the world. And there was a real sense of solidarity and
Yeah.
of kind of, togetherness there, and that rising up against what had just happened, which really did feel like not an attack on America, but it felt like an attack on kind of civilized society.
Yeah.
And of course, that cohesiveness kind of was lost within months, particularly I think when the reaction 9/11 became the global war on terror,
Yeah.
never ending, that people were like, well, hang on. But that moment of like, and people were asking the question. I remember people saying to me, well, we should ask ourselves why this happened. And I think you can make all those points. None of it sort of excuses what
Of course.
bin Laden did. But I think it was more what was lost really was.
Well, you could still reject the point, Greg, right? I'm saying
yeah.
you could hear them out. Here's what they're saying, and the entire country could have said that's just utter nonsense.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But no one even wanted to ask the question what it even is.
Well, I mean, weirdly, I always like to talk to people of all ilks, and I've spent time with people who are, if not directly Al Qaeda, sort of sympathetic, and have heard them out, and it's, I mean, John was a young kid. People who are older and more sophisticated in their thinking, it's interesting. I mean, I disagree with what they say, but I think it's important to understand how people come to the beliefs that they come to, and otherwise we're just kind of, you just come to some. It's the best way to sort of counter it is by understanding where they're coming from.
Yeah, it's an interesting anecdote. I don't think it's in the film, but I remember this anecdote. I must have read it somewhere, where John Walker Lindh's father is corresponding with him. I guess the internet is up and running at that point, so he might have been an email. And he says to him, this is before 9/11, I think he's at that point studying Islam and Arabic in Yemen. And he says, hey, Al Qaeda, or whoever they are, he probably didn't even know who Al Qaeda was, just bombed the USS Cole. And so you should be very careful because you're an American and there you are in Yemen and, this terrible thing happened. And purportedly, I don't know if you probably know this better than I do, John Walker Lindh wrote his father back and he said, well, the United States had no business being in the sovereign waters of Yemen and the USS Cole was appropriately bombed, and then I think the father goes, whoa, I think I just lost my son, right? And this is before 9/11. So you're seeing his thinking, the kid's thinking, he's a teenager, right? He's thinking, of course the Cole should be bombed, right? But you can't imagine any American thinking that. What do you mean the USS Cole should be bombed?
I don't know all the details of that story. I know he was in Yemen. I've not heard that specifically. So I think he was, like, I don't know. Like I said, I find his particular journey almost unknowable.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, in a way, I mean, there's a lot of people who are attracted to the Taliban, attracted to to jihad in various forms, who got caught up in this, and for lots of reasons.
But the difference is, Greg, right, is that you could say, well, in the 60s, people went to Woodstock or people went to India, right? And saying, do we treat the kids that sort of like, went off to India to, study Hindu or, just took acid trips at Woodstock. This felt, I suspect, to most people, yes, he became the face of the Taliban, an American Taliban, disheveled, muddied, but it really was, I think, even to this day, which is what's so interesting and great about your movie, it's forcing us to remember this, because I think most people really don't want to remember this. This is not a good story. This is not a way to start a war, Greg. If you're going to start a war on terror, and your first detainee is an American kid who leaves, a wealthy section of San Francisco to take up arms with the enemy and has this anti-American, even if he didn't feel it, he was fighting on the side of the enemy. The Taliban was fighting our allies, the Northern Alliance. So I just think that it's so embarrassing. On the one hand, it's a sensational story. On the other hand, it's so embarrassing. You can see why you wouldn't want to spend a lot of time talking about it.
Well, what was interesting is, and looking back, I came to think that his capture and what happened to him in the weeks after was really an inflection point in how our society evolved after 9/11. Because, and even in the course of making this, I think it's when the war on terror got a lot more complicated morally, a lot more ambiguous, a lot more uncomfortable. Suddenly it wasn't, we're going to vanquish this great wrong and we're going to fight what was frankly a very easy war in Afghanistan. Suddenly we're capturing people and it's an American, and then, oh, he's being sort of beaten up by our own people, and what's that mean, and why is an American there with the Taliban anyway, and why can't we get bin Laden? What was interesting making the movie is that the key players, from John, his family, his lawyers, to the Bush administration, sort of lawyers, people at the Pentagon, Cheney's office, who made these key decisions at the time, none of them wanted to be a part of this film. In fact, they all kind of wanted the film to go away. They didn't want us to make it.
You can see
why revisit this? Because nobody looks good.
Yeah, it's just awful. You know, speaking of which, the footage that seems to be CNN footage. I don't know. I mean, it's you have something that no one seems to see. I'm watching your movie and I'm going, has anyone ever seen? You have footage of John Walker Lindh actually being interrogated outside this military fortress by the CIA agent Michael Spann, who becomes the first casualty. You actually see them together, right? It's extraordinary. Then you
the Northern
see,
Alliance intelligence guys had a camera there, and that's how we got.
Oh, so it wasn't even a CNN camera. It was
it was not CNN.
So you're actually watching detainee number one and casualty number one talking to each other in English.
Which is unbelievable.
It's crazy, right,
yeah.
Greg? It's literally, and it's in your movie.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's pretty cool that you have. It's crazy. Detainee and casualty talking to each other. And get ready for this. The detainee might have information that very soon will result in the killing of the CIA agent, because he could have said, if he knew, and everyone a lot of the people in your movie suspect that he knew that there was going to be a prison revolt soon, and that the Taliban who were captured with him had weapons, and that he possessed some of them. And so that Mike Spann, who ends up getting killed, could have been saved if this American kid had simply said, hey, brother, if I were you, I would get the hell out of here because something bad is going to go down and you may not survive. Instead, he acts, whether he's complicit.
He says nothing. He says nothing.
He says nothing. And one can conclude, you have Spann's daughter in your movie, in which she says quite eloquently and movingly, he's responsible for my father's death, because I have no doubt that he was in the basement, in the cellar, and he knew that this was going to happen, that there was going to be a prison uprising. And if he had simply told my father would be alive today. So again, you could make any judgment you want about that, but that's in your movie. The actual, it's not even, you didn't fictionalize it. You didn't have to cast anyone. They're the same guys. And then you have other footage of Lynn being sort of interrogated or be questioned by CNN people.
He's a freelance journalist named Robert Pelton.
Right. He's not even officially with CNN, right? He's just sitting there asking Lynn after he's immediately captured and he's getting his first medical attention. We first realize he's an American, and those are the first. Where was that footage until Greg Barker showed it to us?
Here's the weird thing, and is the footage. So I'd made a previous film about the first special forces guys who went into Afghanistan. It's called Legion of Brothers. It was the basis of that movie
with the horses.
A couple years, the horse soldier.
With the horses, the one with the Australian actor, that Thor.
Yes.
Thor.
Yes. Thor. Yeah, exactly. Thor was on a horse.
Thor on a horse.
Chris Hemsworth. Yeah.
So those guys. You're the precursor for that. Wow.
Yeah. So and those guys, that team, the horse soldiers, are actually the same guys who interact with John Lynn in the movie. That's the same team. As it happens, just happens a week or two later. So I knew those guys. I'd made a film about them. In the course of getting all the material, I had in our archive, in a production office, this long interview with John Lindh. And I started talking to it. The idea came up in a conversation with an exec at Showtime named Vinny Malhotra, who had been an ABC News producer in Afghanistan with Peter Jennings around this time. He was interested in the Lindh story. And then I went back to this material that I had, and then one of our assistant editors called it up, and there was this whole long interview with John Walker Lindh that I actually had.
It's unbelievable.
Because Pelton, the journalist, had I'd licensed footage from him before. He's like, give us these boxes of material. Like, I have no idea what's in here. Transfer it. Like, all right, so we did that. And I was going through the footage, and there it is. I was like, I had no idea. I remember like a 2-minute CNN story about, but not this sort of extended interview. And what happened was they did the interview, it was broadcast, and then the same bits kept being replayed and replayed. And then when Lindh was brought to the US and they were preparing for the trial, both the prosecution and the defense subpoenaed the material. And CNN said, you can't have our rushes, and there was a big court fight. So it all kind of got glued up in this kind of legal fight. And then actually the full video we got from the Northern Virginia courthouse. That's where that stuff lives. Crazy, right?
Yeah.
So
you could also imagine defense attorneys saying that we want to make sure that that this is under seal because it's too prejudicial to my client for people to be seeing this video of him saying that he was with the Taliban. Yeah,
and he says in the interview, it's like, I don't want to be filmed.
Yeah, I don't want to be
felt
filmed.
Like, and which is all part of the story. So
So in the film, you are among the many smart questions that the film raises. One is, what is it about treason that seems to be the most of the irredeemable evils? What makes it such a terrible crime? We know about Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution. We're always, it's always in our mind. We've been reminded of, this is another good example of why this movie comes out at the right time, because we're now learning that many of the new leaders of the Taliban used to be prisoners of the United States that were exchanged in the Bo Bergdahl prisoner swap. So people are now remembering, oh, right, that was the American soldier that wandered away from his post and sort of also went off to shake hands with the Taliban. And eventually there was a prisoner exchange where President Obama traded him, and there were American military people who said, wait a minute, you're trading the lives. Remember, eight American servicemen were killed trying to look for Bergdahl. Right. So this is
a complicated story, but
it's a very sensitive subject. It's a very sensitive. It's a very sensitive subject. That this trade, and now people are saying, well, wait a minute. Some of the leaders are the guys that we let go in order to bring this guy who was a traitor, a deserter. So maybe can you discuss maybe why you think it is such a loaded term and why people do see it as such an extraordinary betrayal?
Yeah, I mean, I think just because it strikes at, I think it's probably true with any country with a strong national identity, with sense of betrayal of somebody from your own community turning against you. I think that's why. I think, Well,
also, doesn't he understand? Also, does he not understand what American freedom means? Right, that idea, right? Isn't that the argument? Don't you get the concept of what it means to be an American? Why would you trade that to be a part of the Taliban?
Well, what his lawyers would say, and he was represented by really this towering figure of human rights law out of San Francisco, James Brosnahan, former federal prosecutor, and he would say that, I mean, when John Lindh joined the Taliban, he was totally within his rights to do that. There was nothing, they were not designated as a terrorist organization. It was pre 9/11. He had no intention of fighting the US, and he was free to do that. So partly it's like he was vilified as a traitor and blamed for the complicity in Spann's death. The government, by the way, did drop those charges eventually, that he was not, they admitted they had no evidence.
Yeah, but I want to come back to that also, Greg. I want to talk about it because I don't know whether that's true or whether it's because he was tortured and they were afraid that in order to prove those counts, they would have to release the information that was obtained under torture. And at that point, all bets were off. There's no way
Well-
the government would do that. And they would have done anything to get rid of that. So, take your 20 years, go away and shut your mouth. We're going to give you a gag order. We don't want to ever
Yeah.
hear from you again.
Well, there was, yeah. So this is why it's trying to figure out what actually happened is so it kind of drives you crazy actually, because so much of it is shrouded in mystery and
Yeah.
and memory. But I think so. So Lindh, whether he, for me, it's the key moment is the interaction with Mike Spann and the other CIA officer when he's taken out and they're talking to him and he says nothing. So at that moment, is he making some kind of choice? You can argue that.
But Greg, one
yes,
second.
he was.
That scene, it's important for our audience, and hopefully they'll all watch it tonight at midnight. But Greg, that scene that you're describing, 9/11 had already happened.
Yeah. And by then 9/11 had happened.
Right. So it's a little different there, because your point, the defense counsel's point is a good point. The First Amendment freedom of association allows him to associate with anyone he wants to associate. If he wants to hang out with the Taliban, he can do that. If he wants to hang out with the Ku Klux Klan, he can do that, right? They're not on a list of prohibited groups of terror at that time. But the real issue with him was, unless he was literally not reading the newspaper, he did not know that at the time that he was fighting against the Northern Alliance, the United States had already declared war on the Taliban. So he was at that point, it's hard for him to then say, no, I'm fighting the Northern Alliance. I'm not really fighting the United States.
Yeah, it's true. And the other thing is he speaks Arabic. He doesn't speak the Afghan languages. So he is put either by design or just for convenience with people who speak Arabic, who are, most of those guys are Al-Qaeda, okay? So there's the Taliban, but then Al-Qaeda remnants are fighting with them. And these guys have all been through, including John, had been through a Al-Qaeda training camp. So it's a little, it gets very, very, kind of complicated.
What you just said makes it look worse. What you just said makes it work worse for him, because he's not only, he's literally fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. At that point, it's not just the Taliban.
Yeah, but goes back to my point. I think I don't think he was a significant battlefield commander. I just don't think he was that significant of a figure. He was caught up in this rush of events. He was made really stupid choices that maybe he believed. He was almost like a true believer, but what he actually did, it's hard to kind of pin that down precisely.
So in the movie you point out, well, first of all, let me ask you this. We now know, it's important to the audience, if they're not aware of this, he was released from prison early. He pleaded guilty to 2 of the counts of the 10. One was providing assistance to the Taliban, and I think the second count was carrying a weapon, a rifle and a grenade while he's assisting the Taliban. So they dropped the other 8 charges. Apparently, if he had been convicted of all of them, he would be in jail for 180 years, I think, 90 years, and then an additional 90, it would be 100. So instead, he gets sentenced to 20 years. That is a plea
bargain. There's a plea bargain.
Right, I'm sorry, right. Yeah. He plea bargains, so that there is no trial. So there's a couple things that are interesting about that. The first of which is there no Guantanamo Bay at the time? Is it so early?
Correct. There's no Guantanamo.
Yeah.
There's no Guantanamo. And you're right, what you said previously is that one of the reasons there was a plea bargain, the plea, as far as I can understand it, was initiated by the government.
Yes.
Because they did not want to put these special forces guys on the stand to talk about, because he was mistreated. I mean, there's no question. At first, they saved his life. He's passed along the chain of command. At some point, soldiers are putting obscenities on his forehead. He's bruised, battered. I mean, he's not treated well.
And he's on two different military ships, right? I'm told that there was a lot of places that were like black ops, so they could have pretty much done anything to him and no one would have known. Right.
Correct. And it took him 55 days to come back to the US and to first meet his lawyer and appear in court. So lots happened to him in that time. So
and whatever his confession is, his confession is without a lawyer.
Yes.
And in theory, based on what you just said, the confession could be under duress. He could have been waterboarded for all we know, right? And
He wasn't, but as far as we know, but yes, he could. I mean, we don't know. The way his lawyer put it was he didn't view it as torture, but he viewed it as severe physical abuse. Yeah. So he was.
So it's important to keep in mind. So he enters into a plea bargain that gets him 20 years.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of this war on terror. We haven't quite figured out yet what we're going to do with these detainees. So we get rid of this guy, who's the American, because his story is just so unpleasant. We don't want this one on television. We don't want to know about this one. You know, for people who haven't followed this, you know, Guantanamo Bay was the perfect answer for this problem, which is call everyone an enemy combatant, put it offshore, put it to get it in Cuba, make sure the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are not standing outside. And then we can hold not civilian trials, but military commissions where the full panoply of constitutional protections do not apply. And let's go do that. But it wasn't, at that point, we weren't set up with the post-Patriot Act judicial system that we created. And so I guess we could make the argument that the government just wanted to get rid of Lindh, just put him away. But it does seem to me, given what happened, that 20 years was a pretty light sentence, no?
Depends on what well, if you just look at the charges, you're
saying on the two charges alone?
The two charges, he would likely have gotten less. If it had not been such a big kind of a case with a lot of publicity, he would, based on other similar cases in later years.
So you're saying he might have been
like 7 years.
Over punished for the
he could have gotten like 7 to 10 years. I think from his perspective, look, the government wanted it to go away. You're absolutely right about that. The trial was gonna happen in federal courthouse in Northern Virginia, roughly on the first anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah.
So they weren't. I don't think his legal team was optimistic about the outcome and would just prefer a plea bargain to go into a jury. But on the actual legal charges of what the government could prove, he was probably over sentenced, is what I would, based on other cases since. It would normally be 7 to 10 years in that for the range.
But I think you can make the argument, Greg, that the government's experience with Lindh helped clarify to them what they needed to do, which is to avoid get out of federal courts, forget the federal court system, go to Guantanamo Bay, call them military commissions, forget the Fourth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment. It doesn't really apply in the same way. Forget the Miranda warnings in the same way. And for that matter, forget the enhanced interrogation techniques, because that way you can do whatever you want to people in the black ops. And it's not like they're going to be in Foley Square in New York or in Los Angeles County with everyone saying, what did you do to him? You what?
Yes.
So
the thing is, we found out about all that anyway. So my personal view is they should have tried all these people. They should have tried Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He'd been serving life in prison now.
You're saying everyone should have received the civilian trial?
Yes, because our legal system can handle it. We can convict and try all sorts of really bad people and do it, in full view of the world. Why not these guys? Why give them this special treatment? It in a way elevated them and gave them an importance I don't think they deserved. They are just these thugs, criminals who did these horrible things, deserve to be punished for them, particularly like someone like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But why create a whole separate system for him? What were we afraid of? And I think they were afraid of the interrogation, all that coming out. But it all came out anyway. So why not trust our system?
Well, a couple things. First of all, it's interesting that you point that out, because it was just last week, or maybe it was just last week, that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 other of the Guantanamo detainees were finally brought to their military commission, not a civilian trial, their military commission. And it's now on pause again. So look, this is a guy that they captured nearly, 18 years ago, whatever.
2003, 3 or 4, they got him. Yeah.
I mean, it's been nearly 20 years. He's been sitting.
And there's plenty of evidence. He's confessed that he did 9/11.
But there are people, Greg, who would say, Well, if you prosecuted him, say here in New York in federal court in Foley Square, why let a guy like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed get a soapbox? Because he would be given a chance to speak, and give his indictment against America. I think there are government officials that said, we don't want to give them their day in court. They don't deserve an actual day in court, not one where they get to spew all of their hatreds of America. And the point that you and I have been raising, which is he's also going to tell them what they did to him. But the truth is, Greg, in an American courtroom, that itself, the evidence that rose out of the torture, enhanced interrogation techniques, whatever you want to call it, would have essentially been excluded, right?
Yes.
So the problem with those cases, Greg, is that it could ended up, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it could ended up as an acquittal because the main evidence would have been ultimately excluded because of Fourth Amendment problems or Eighth Amendment problems or Sixth Amendment problems. So I think that that's the fear. You're right that we ended up finding out all this stuff anyway, but I think that what the government's position is, it would be morally unbearable to discover that at the end of these trials, the main charges were dismissed because we didn't actually have the evidence, because the evidence was obtained under intent.
There was plenty of evidence that was available through other channels.
I think without the tortured piece.
Yeah, of course, all that would have been excluded, but it's being excluded in Guantanamo anyway. It's like it would have all. There was plenty of other, particularly with KSM, for instance, lots of other evidence, and that would have been admissible. And so, I mean, my view is, yes, of course, he would have a soapbox, but people who want to consume and believe Al-Qaeda propaganda, it's out there anyway.
Yeah.
And that is, this again, the strength of our system. Let people have their say, and in a fair, open court of law, and then let the jury rule. And I'm not afraid of our system. That's I think it could have withstood that easily.
But I want to go back to
and
something
we would have been better
said.
off for it.
You're probably right. I mean, I just think that the law professor in me keeps thinking, well, could you actually have proof of the things that you've alleged him to do if you're excluding evidence?
Yeah.
And the mere fact that you're excluding so much evidence is embarrassing. So you can imagine the government's position is, we can't use this, we can't use this, we can't use this. And the jury knows why we can't use it. And that's a terrible thing. And MSNBC is going to love this. And PBS is going to love this, because they're going to point out all the things that America did that was morally unimaginable. And it's going to be right there for the world to see. And we can sort of fudge it, hide it a little in Guantanamo Bay in a military commission. But I do think the point you said at the outset is important, because you said, well, look, when I think of him as a real, a young marginal character, right? You said, when you said, I can't give him a full indictment, but I do think that his story, right, is so beyond who he was, right? For instance, what we just said now, it might be that the entire legal strategy, right, that was evolving through the Patriot Act and the National Surveillance Act, all of its origins are tied a little to these early cases. And what
to him directly, I think that's right.
Yeah, people are saying they were probably Justice Department officials were probably going, we don't want another Mark Walker Lindh problem. This is going to be a Mark Walker Lindh problem. And we've got to figure out a way to keep this, out of the public eye. And Guantanamo is really far away.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a cynical approach, but it did work. But let me just say, you're right. There were civilian trials. Not all of them were conducted military commissions. But what I was saying before happened a lot, which is that I think this happened to bin Laden's chauffeur. He ends up getting like a life sentence, but I think of the 38 charges, 37 were dismissed. So he ends up serving a life sentence for 2 of the charges. And I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. We're like over 30 charges were ultimately dismissed because of either lack of evidence or because of this enhanced interrogation techniques excluded evidence. And so I don't know whether everyone picked up on that and said, isn't this really terrible? Because people look, well, he's in jail anyway. What's the difference? Well, there is a difference, right? because 37, if most of the charges are dismissed because of torture, that is significant. And there are people that are interested in that. Even if you put them away for life, it doesn't change the fact that it exposed the country to some of the things that were done in the name of the war on terror. Let's talk about the fact that Lindh is an American citizen. He's listed as an enemy combatant. And again, the government goes through this civilian trial, avoids the civilian trial by proposing a plea deal that he accepts. I'm thinking of the Muslim cleric in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki. You remember,
American, also
right,
American.
born in Arizona. His father still lives in Arizona. You don't spend a lot of talking to Mr. Al-Awlaki Sr., but if you did, the first thing he says is, let me see this. My son was an American citizen. And yes, he went to Yemen and he made these really terrible anti-American videos. And a lot of people were influenced by the videos, like Major Hassan, the Fort Hood killing. The Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston Marathon brothers, they both in their computers had the videos of al-Awlaki. So al-Awlaki is taken out with a drone strike. And Mr. Al-Awlaki Sr. in Arizona is going, you killed my son, who's an American. Where was his due process protections? Where were his constitutional rights? I just think that the Lindh also introduced us to this too. What do you do with an American citizen who you're going to deem an enemy combatant, but by all rights under the Constitution deserves the full panoply of rights? And that to say that the strict application of those rules don't apply to him because he made these creepy videos out in Yemen, there are people, certainly the ACLU would agree with this. I have my doubts, but there are certainly people, a number of lawyers that would say, how can you kill an American citizen with a drone strike in another country simply because, yes, he's influenced other terrorists? So I'm wondering whether, I think your film is important there too, because it raises another legal question that became important in some cases. What do you do about the people who actually engage with the enemy, and not only engage, they inspire the enemy, like a Muslim cleric who leaves the United States, but he didn't leave behind his passport. He's still an American citizen, and your movie addresses that question. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is, again, why I found the Lindh story so compelling. Is it was this inflection point where these questions start coming up, and I think it was deep with Lindh. I mean, looking at the news coverage, even somebody who knew this story, it was shocking to remember and to see the onslaught of coverage everywhere. Time, all the networks, the president, all talking about this guy, as if he was so kind of this face of evil. Now, Anwar al-Awlaki was different. He was operational. I mean, this is what the Obama and White House are the people who actually made that decision.
You're saying the justification is a little different.
He left the country. He was operational in Yemen, and the idea. I mean, John Walker Lindh was found on the battlefield. The special operation guys who found him thought, when they realized he was American, saw that he was in shock, and also thought, well, maybe he's a CIA officer undercover. I mean, I had no idea who this guy was.
Why would why else would he be there unless he was
Why would he be there? Yeah.
Right.
So now Al-Awlaki is different because by then he had been doing this for years, and then
he'd been radicalizing everyone, basically.
Yeah, and so they made a decision that he was not simply an American captured on the battlefield. He was an operational, and they declared him an enemy combatant, which is how they justified that. But still, of course, it's complicated.
Yeah. So given what you said before about military commissions versus civilian trials, I was going to give you a good anecdote that comes out of FOLCS for us. You're not our first director. Now we can add to the illustrious list of directors, Greg Barker, but we've had Peter Bogdanovich and Barry Levinson and Oliver Stone and Robert Benton and on and on and on. And we had Sidney Lumet.
Oh, great.
Who I figured you would know and be impressed that he was, you're following in his footsteps. That's Sidney Lumet. And I had him, he made a movie for HBO that virtually nobody saw except us. It was called Strip Search. He directed it. Tom Fontana wrote it. And it was about two different interrogations, one in the United States and one in China, that mirror each other, that end in a strip search. It was so loaded, it came out within the first year or two of 9/11 that HBO aired it one time at 3 a.m. It was just too loaded. Yeah, so the FOLCS audience had an incredible treat. We watched it in an auditorium with Sidney Lumet and Tom Fontana. Now, remember, there was a lot of confusion in those days, right? Which is the point that you just made with, they found an American. It's so everything is so confusing that first few years. Remember, we have to remind ourselves the warnings, the orange, the amber alert, the green alert, could you go outside? Was it safe to cross the Brooklyn Bridge? There was an enormous amount of confusion. So I asked Sidney Lumet, I said, this is the beginning of these questions about, does the war on terror require certain exceptions to the general rules? So I said to him, and Sidney Lumet is an old-time lefty, depression baby, old-time lefty progressive. So I said to Sidney Lumet, he was about 81 at the time, and I said, if you knew you could save 3,000 people by torturing them, by torching one person, one enemy combatant who had the knowledge that a 9/11 would happen, and you could save everyone's life, would you torture one person? And this was the kind of moral questions that people were uneasily grappling with. So we have video. You can go on our website and go to one of our early events and see the legendary Sidney Lumet literally uncomfortable. And he literally says, and he's pausing, he's stalling, he goes, I'd have to really know that that person knows. And if he did, I guess I'd have to, right? And that was sort of interesting, right? Because this was years later, he probably wouldn't have said this. And now nobody would say this. Now it would be incredibly unfashionable. But it is an interesting time capsule, Greg, to remember what your film is about. It's really about chaos, those early days where, names that no one ever knew the words Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. Nobody knew.
Exactly.
Nobody
we all had to
knew.
catch up, and we were reading these the papers so carefully to sort of get these names in our head and wrap ourselves around who they were, and jihad and
jihad. I remember, Greg, the first couple days that many, and I'm not naming names, but many of the CNN anchors kept mispronouncing Osama bin Laden's name. Because they really hadn't said his name. He'd been around. He was responsible for the coal and the embassy bombings in Kenya, Tanzania and Kenya, and of course the World Trades. But he wasn't in our consciousness. So I think that in watching Detainee 001, I'm encouraging the audience to think about that period of, today we take it for granted, right? We just departed from Afghanistan, right? But in those days, we just entered Afghanistan, and there was an enormous confusion and chaos. And even an old school lefty would say, torture someone to save 3,000 lives. And by the way, there are probably still people who would say, yes, that's the appropriate ratio. To save 3,000 lives, it would be worth it. And there were some people that would say, there is no limit on the lives that you could save, but you couldn't torture someone. Let's talk a little about, since you made Sergio both as a documentary and also as a feature film. I haven't seen the documentary, but the film that you made, it's on Netflix. I'm encouraging everyone to watch it. It's excellent. And it gives you a sense of what's in Greg Barker's head, because he's clearly mastered this, domain, this territory. I would think that American Taliban, Mark Walker Lindh, there's a movie in that, feature film. Is there not one, because you wouldn't see a movie about Benedict Arnold that put him in a sympathetic light? It's because Americans don't make movies unless the protagonist is sympathetic, and it would be disgusting to make American Taliban, sympathetic, just like you wouldn't make a movie about Osama bin Laden to make him look sympathetic, to say he was an abused child. You could think of all the things you might say about, right? And the reason I'm asking you this question is because the Germans did this recently with Hitler in the last—
The Bunker.
The Bunker, exactly.
Great movie.
Untertag, right. The Bunker is a very good example of a film that the Germans were struggling with. Can we make a movie in which we see that Hitler liked dogs and he was very nice to children and secretaries. He was very nice, you know, or is it disgusting for us to even open that up? And I'm wondering, is that really what would be the major impediment to a feature, or do you know of a way you could make this film about him?
So I think, you know, like I have thought about this. Like, is there, like my friend Peter Bergen has a book that's just come out, a biography of bin Laden.
Oh, wow.
And he just talks about, and of course he knows the story very well, but he describes like the last day in the compound in Abbottabad, where bin Laden's like, you know, arguing with his wives, arguing with the couriers. It's like domestic chaos, and he's worried about his kids, and his life's going off track, and then the Americans come. And so, you mean that is kind of like the bunker with Hitler in a way. It's like, so, but I'm not sure I would want to watch that movie yet. I'm not sure that that's something that, so
you think there is an issue of, like, what comedians say, the word too soon? You think
too soon, maybe? And with John Lindh, I think for me, the problem with his story, the way it probably has been, when anyone's thought about it, the way how you would tell that, I think he's just so, it's hard to know exactly what he meant, and he's hard to grasp. So I think that is a narrative challenge. I think in making this film, the one sort of world I wanted to penetrate and I couldn't was the plea bargain deal. Like because what you had is like all of the witnesses gathered in Washington, including the special operation guys, the journalists whose footage had been subpoenaed, Lynn's family, and they're all ready to go to the first public discovery hearings on the Monday, and they gather over the weekend. Over the weekend, that's when the Bush administration reaches out to the defense attorneys and they hash out this plea bargain. Because why? Because each side is worried about the full truth coming out, what the outcome might be. That's interesting to me. That kind of like where Lindh is like a periphery figure, but the decisions that are coming out of Cheney's office and the defense team, maybe there's something in that. But I think it's just kind of hard to grasp. I do think that, you know, we're only 20 years, right? 20 years, it's hard to imagine how much has happened over the last 20 years since 9/11. But dramatically, I think we're still trying to make sense of what it all means. And we're still making movies about World War I, World War II, about the Holocaust, and grappling with that. Yeah. And maybe now is the time to start thinking about, you know, what's going to be the great film about the 9/11 era. Maybe there have been some great films, but maybe the seminal film hasn't been made yet, you know, and maybe that'll come in the next 10, 20 years.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because I was just about to say, not only are you not our first director, but you're not even our first 9/11 film. We've been working this issue for many years. Yes, we did Strip Search early on with the City and Lumet, but we did Eye in the Sky,
great movie,
which is a great movie. We did Zero Dark 30. We had we did that one. We had the former United States Attorney General Mike Mukasey and the former New York City Police Commissioner for that. We had we had Kristen Stewart, the young actress, fresh off her Twilight series. She made a film called Camp X-Ray. Very few people saw it. She plays a guard in Guantanamo Bay, and it's really about the moral choices that are made by both prisoner and captive and guard. So she made a film. I'm trying to think what else we've done. Oh, you reminded me of film, the one called The Report, which was based on that. Yeah. Right. That film, I think we did that. So I like what you just said, because I was thinking about some of the films were criticized, like for instance, Zero Dark 30 was criticized and American Sniper was criticized, because it does seem as if making a movie that is fully endorsing the war on terror also does not appeal to a large segment of Americans. You know, it's typical
I remember I was at a screening once, a previous screening of Black Hawk Down, and somebody asked Ridley Scott, it's like a pro-war movie. It's like, you can't make a war movie and make a pro-war movie. There's nothing pro-war about Zero Dark 30 or American Sniper. But you're watching that and you think, I want to go to war? No, it's, you know, it humanizes the conflict and the toll it has and the seduction of war, which is very real. But I think, and Zero Dark 30, there were specific problems, I think, with the way the torture scenes.
Well, the people, they claim it was a pro-torture movie. There are people that claim.
Well, I think the mistake they made was saying that
Right.
they said, I think it's to say that the torture directly led to the breakthrough in the Courier
Yes.
is a simplification, which I think
that they would have never found the Courier had they not had the one waterboarding scene.
Yeah, but the world and the way the CIA felt at the time, that was pretty accurate as far as I can.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting the way Americans and the American culture has responded to the war on terror. This has been America's longest war. It started off with, the most horrific of American incidents, an attack on the American, homeland in such a horrific way. You would think that in the beginning, remember President Bush used the words, "You're either with us or against us." That was his message to France, right?
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying the John Walker Lindh story is really terrible because, if you're trying to galvanize American support for what would eventually become a 20-year war, that is not the right face. A kid from Marin County, Northern California, that's not the right way to go. If you're trying to tell the French, you're with us and we're going to change the name French fries to freedom fries.
Yeah.
Then we better not start off with the first detainee being a kid from San Francisco. But I do think that, well, let me just ask you, so what I was saying, it's interesting that throughout the war, most of the films were very highly scrutinized not to show a pro-war on terror perspective. And that is not true of World War II movies, right? The Greatest Generation. There's something about this last 20 years that I don't think, I think you're right, we maybe not have seen the right film, but even the right book yet hasn't come out to try to speak about the complexity of what you said in the beginning. You said, I'm not so much interested in the John Walker Lindh, I'm interested in what it says about us, right? That was your point earlier, said, I think it says a lot more about us. And you're right about that, because it does say a lot of different things about us, including our own ambivalence as we were going forward in the war and winning the war. But there was ambivalence all the way through that even when we tried to make movies about it, they were overly scrutinized for being pro-war on terror films.
Well, because I think the war on terror, like I said, we were talking about before, is like you had this outpouring of support really across society, across the world after 9/11. Yeah. And then it got a bit messier with Iraq. I mean, I think it's when it was Saddam equated to Saddam and invaded that, it got a lot more divisive, and complicated.
No, I think you're right. Your film is really talking about just one theater of war. We're not yet at the second theater of war, Iraq, which eventually becomes the major theater of war. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Before we say goodnight to Greg, let's take a question from the audience and we'll have a few closing remarks and then we'll say goodnight to Greg. And I hope that tonight at midnight, you'll all be watching Detainee 001 on our friend Showtime's network, our producing partners. This comes from Nancy Zimmerman, who says, why do so many view treason as the worst crime you can commit? A worse crime than the killing of your parents or your children, for example? What is there about treason that is so abhorrent? Now, we touched on this a little, Greg, but there is more to say. I think Nancy's point is correct, that if you even compare it morally to other crimes, I think in the movie, you say, or somewhere that I read something that it represents a breaking of trust. Speaking of which, breaking of trust, Nancy just reminded me of one last question that I wanted to ask you, that from the movie. And then while we're all ruminating more on Nancy's question about treason itself, in the movie at one point, Lindh says, the uprising that eventually claimed the life of detainee, of casualty number one, Mike Spann, he says it was a mistake. It wasn't really planned. It was just a few guys that made a mistake. And when he's asked more, he says, well, the mistake is that we had already surrendered to the Northern Alliance, and that would be breaking an Islamic contract under military terms. I was
Islamic.
literally.
He's saying he's under Islamic law, that would be breaking an agreement.
Yeah. And I have to tell you, of the many things that come out of this movie that had me like, what did he just say? because he literally says it couldn't have been a planned uprising because all of us are Islamists. And because we're Islamists under Islamic law, we could not breach a promise we made to the Northern Alliance in war that we would surrender all of our weapons and that we would surrender, that we were not going to continue engage in warfare activity. And he's saying
that's why, and that's a great. I'm glad you picked up on that. That to me, that says the whoever was leading that Al Qaeda group did not take John Walker Lindh very seriously. The young kid who thinks he's an expert on Islam. None of them are thinking that. I mean, come on, it's war. They're not thinking, oh, we can't lie to the North. No way.
Yeah.
And so he was naive. And
it speaks to what you said earlier about the way you view him. You can see that in that answer that he's saying, oh, none of us would have engaged in that because we were promising not to do that. Yeah. And you're going,
I think he's sincere when he says that. That's the thing. It's like,
I think you're probably right. But it sounds so nutty. You know, that in the middle of this unbelievable doomsday war, the United States is going to be pounding away, that the issue of what we promised the Northern Alliance, we would never carry a machine gun after we promised them that we would never carry a rifle again. All right, Greg, before we say goodnight, let's just say we have a couple closing announcements, and I'm going to send everyone off to watch this movie of yours, Detainee 001 on Showtime. Let's see, what do we got? What's coming up? Yes, of course. The deadline, we've extended it a little it's now the late deadline for submissions to the FOLCS International Short Film Competition for a FOLCS Awards Night. It's one of the favorite things that we do, a real fan favorite. We get submissions from literally all over the world: Iran, South Korea, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus.
Almost done, 1 minute.
So you still have a chance to sign up for that. Let's see, what else? We have an event, I think, next week. Yes, that's right. The film Blue Bayou, a feature film. We have the director, who's also the writer, and the star, Justin Chan. It's about a Korean who spends 30 years as an adoptee in Louisiana, and then he faces a deportation hearing. And Justin, who's the writer, director, and star, another actor, Mark O'Brien, and Michael Wilds, an immigration lawyer, will joining us. I think that's for now. We've got some other things lining up for the end of September and October, so stay tuned. Yes, folks, we have not shut down during the pandemic at all. We have not charged tickets. And because of the Delta virus and the ongoing pandemic, we're not going to live stage, at least for the immediate future. So if you're interested in supporting your cultural institutions throughout the pandemic, we're out there with you. So you can donate to FOLCS. There's also a button here to my right. I think there's also gives you a button that you could press and it take you right to it. Greg, congratulations on the film. Congratulations on really a wonderful career. And you're a young guy, so we're expecting to see much, much more stuff. Watch out for Greg Barker. Make sure you watch Detainee 001. Congratulations, Greg. And it was really, it was a great enjoyment to hear you and talk to you and meet you. You were a really wonderful guest.
Oh, you too, Thane. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Good night, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS.
Good night.
Until next time. Good night.